The Vietnam War, also known as the Second Indochina War, was a conflict that took place in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia from the 1st of November, 1955, to the 30th of April, 1975. It was a struggle between communist forces, led by North Vietnam and supported by its communist allies, and the government of South Vietnam, backed by the United States and other anti-communist nations. This war emerged from the long-standing tensions stemming from French colonialism and the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. French colonialism and the First Indochina War. Vietnam had been under French colonial rule since the mid-19th century. Following World War II, Ho Chi Minh, a communist revolutionary, sought to establish an independent Vietnam. In 1945, he declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which was recognized only by communist countries. This led to the First Indochina War, lasting from 1946 to 1954, between French forces and the Viet Minh, the communist-led nationalist movement. After 8 years of fighting, the conflict ended with the Geneva Accords in July of 1954, splitting Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with Ho Chi Minh's communist government controlling the north and a pro-Western government under Emperor Bao Dai ruling the south. The emergence of the Vietnam conflict. The Geneva Accords mandated elections to unify Vietnam by 1956, but South Vietnam's president, Ngo Dinh Diem, with support from the United States, refused to hold them. Diem, a staunch anti-communist, established a repressive regime that alienated many South Vietnamese, particularly the Buddhist majority. This led to increased support for the National Liberation Front, NLF, also known as the Viet Cong, a communist insurgency in the South that sought to overthrow Diem and reunify the country under communist rule. By the late 1950s, the conflict between the Viet Cong and the South Vietnamese government had intensified, with the North supplying the insurgency. This marked the beginning of a full-scale civil war in South Vietnam. The United States, fearing the spread of communism in Asia, became increasingly involved, providing financial aid and military advisors to the South. Escalation of U.S. involvement. In August of 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, where North Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly attacked U.S. Navy ships. This event led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which allowed President Lyndon B. Johnson to escalate U.S. military involvement without a formal declaration of war. By March of 1965, the first U.S. combat troops landed in Vietnam, marking the start of direct American involvement in the war. Throughout the late 1960s, the United States escalated its military presence in Vietnam, peaking at over 500,000 troops in 1968. The war saw widespread use of aerial bombardment, particularly in Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Despite the massive U.S. military presence, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army, NVA, continued their guerrilla warfare tactics, making it difficult for the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces to secure a decisive victory. The Tet Offensive. One of the most significant turning points of the Vietnam War was the Tet Offensive, launched by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong on the 31st of January, 1968. The offensive was a coordinated series of attacks on more than 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam. Though the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces eventually repelled the attacks, the scale and intensity of the offensive shocked the American public, leading to widespread opposition to the war. The Tet Offensive demonstrated the resilience of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, despite the heavy casualties they suffered. It also highlighted the limitations of the U.S. military strategy in Vietnam, as the war was increasingly seen as unwinnable. Public support for the war in the United States plummeted, leading President Johnson to announce that he would not seek re-election in March of 1968. Nixon and the policy of Vietnamization. In 1969, President Richard Nixon took office with a promise to achieve peace with honor in Vietnam. His administration implemented a policy of Vietnamization, which aimed to gradually withdraw U.S. troops and transfer the responsibility for the war to the South Vietnamese military. This policy was accompanied by secret bombing campaigns in neighboring Cambodia and Laos, aimed at disrupting the North Vietnamese supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Despite the efforts of Vietnamization, the South Vietnamese forces struggled to contain the communist insurgency on their own. The U.S. continued its withdrawal, and by 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, leading to a ceasefire and the withdrawal of the remaining U.S. forces. However, the war between North and South Vietnam continued. The fall of Saigon. The final phase of the Vietnam War came in the spring of 1975, when North Vietnamese forces launched a massive offensive against South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese Army, weakened by the absence of U.S. support, was unable to stop the advance. On the 30th of April, 1975, the capital of South Vietnam, Saigon, fell to the Communist forces, marking the official end of the Vietnam War. The country was reunified under Communist control, and Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. The impact of the war. The Vietnam War had profound effects on Vietnam, the United States, and the wider world. In Vietnam, the war resulted in the deaths of an estimated 2 million civilians, 1.1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers, and between 250,000 and 450,000 South Vietnamese soldiers. The destruction caused by the war left much of the country in ruins, and it would take decades for Vietnam to recover. In the United States, the war deeply divided the nation and eroded trust in the government. It was the first war to be extensively covered by television, and graphic images of the conflict played a significant role in shaping public opinion. The anti-war movement, which had begun in the early 1960s, grew to include millions of Americans, including students, intellectuals, and veterans. The Vietnam War also had a lasting impact on U.S. foreign policy. The war was a major factor in the adoption of the so-called Vietnam Syndrome, a reluctance to engage in overseas military interventions without clear objectives. This hesitancy influenced U.S. foreign policy for decades, as leaders sought to avoid another Vietnam-style quagmire. Post-war Vietnam. After the fall of Saigon, Vietnam was reunified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The new government, led by the Communist Party, faced the enormous task of rebuilding the country. The post-war years were marked by economic hardship, as Vietnam struggled to recover from the devastation of the war and the loss of foreign aid. The government implemented socialist economic policies, including land collectivization and the nationalization of industry, but these measures were largely unsuccessful in alleviating poverty. In the late 1970s, Vietnam became involved in another conflict, this time with its neighbor, Cambodia. The Vietnamese government, under the leadership of General Secretary Le Duan, intervened to overthrow the Khmer Rouge regime, which had committed genocide in Cambodia. This led to a brief but intense border war with China in 1979, as China supported the Khmer Rouge. Vietnam remained isolated from the international community for much of the 1980s, but the government began to adopt market reforms in the late 1980s and early 1990s under the policy of Doi Moi, or renovation. These reforms helped to spur economic growth, and Vietnam gradually reintegrated into the global economy. By the early 21st century, Vietnam had become one of the fastest growing economies in Southeast Asia. The legacy of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War left a lasting legacy on both Vietnam and the United States. In Vietnam, the war is remembered as a heroic struggle for national liberation and reunification. The war is commemorated in museums, monuments, and official narratives that emphasize the sacrifice and resilience of the Vietnamese people. In the United States, the Vietnam War remains a subject of deep reflection and debate. The war prompted a re-evaluation of U.S. military and foreign policy, as well as the role of the media and public opinion in shaping the course of war. Many Vietnam veterans, numbering over 2.7 million who served in Vietnam, returned home to a divided nation, and many suffered from physical and psychological trauma, including post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The war also had a profound impact on American culture, inspiring a vast body of literature, films, and music. Iconic works such as the novels The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, the film Apocalypse Now directed by Francis Ford Coppola, and the song Fortunate Son by Creedence Clearwater Revival reflect the complexities and emotional weight of the war. The Vietnam War was a defining conflict of the 20th century, with far-reaching consequences for Vietnam, the United States, and the world. It was a war shaped by Cold War tensions, national liberation movements, and the limits of U.S. military power. The war's legacy continues to influence contemporary debates on war, peace, and U.S. foreign policy. While the Vietnam War ended nearly half a century ago, its impact is still felt today, both in the countries directly involved and in the broader global community.